Okay, so today I'll be speaking about the incident of vermiculite asbestos mining that occurred in Libby, Montana. So, to start, I'll give a brief background about what happened. So, there was a prominent vermiculite mine in Libby, Montana that was tainted with asbestos and became one of the largest environmental disasters in the US. This mine, that was owned by W.R. Grace, killed hundreds of miners while thousands of Libby residents were sickened by the toxic dust. This particular mine was a big source of the world's vermiculite supply. And it contained asbestos, specifically the tremolite actinolite. Some brief health impacts that occurs after exposure to asbestos include mesothelioma, lung cancer, and asbestosis. A little background about mining and processing. So the miners and the workers at the mine, as well as residents of the surrounding area, were all exposed to the asbestos, leading to increased rates of asbestos-related illnesses like that I mentioned before. Vermiculite from the Libby mine, often sold under the brand name Zonolite, was used in various products including insulation for homes and buildings. W.R. Grace, which operated the Libby mine, was aware of the asbestos contamination but continued mining and did not fully warn workers or the public about the risk. The current guidance, due to the difficulty in distinguishing between vermiculite from the Libby mine and other sources, as well as concerns about inaccuracies in analytical methods, the EPA advised just assuming that vermiculite insulation may be contaminated with asbestos in any building that used product from this mine. Lastly, to minimize the risk of exposure, it is recommended to avoid disturbing vermiculite-based insulation and to hire licensed asbestos contractors for any necessary removal or remediation. So that's just to be brief background. Now we'll go into the timeline of kind of what happened. And then we will go over some other figures. Okay, so going over the timeline. So in 2002, after they realized the contamination, it demanded a large-scale investigation, and the mine in Libby was finally placed on the EPA's Superfund list. Then, in 2008, W.R. Grace was ordered to provide $250 million to cover future cleanup costs of the mine and surrounding areas. By 2018, the agency's cleanup efforts finally began to wind down. In September 2021, the agency announced that another major section of the sprawling restoration effort had been completed. This area was called Operable Unit 8 and included all the roadways and major highways in between Libby and Troy. And lastly, in 2003, W.R. Grace agreed to an $18.5 million settlement to restore damaged lands in and around the Libby, Montana site. Okay, so figure 2. So this graph is just showing some of the demographic and exposure characteristics of the personnel that worked in the mine. So as you can see from this figure, the majority of the workers were born in around the year 1920, and a majority were hired around 1950. So you can assume that most of the workers were in their 20s and 30s. This next figure is looking at the categories of relative risk that occurred with the workers. So in this figure, 3 indices of exposure were used. Index A is average intensity over the first 5 years of employment. Index B is cumulative exposure, and Index C is residence-weighted cumulative exposure. So as you can see from this figure, Index C, which is the cumulative exposure for which each year's exposure is weighted according to the numbers of years since it was experienced, had the highest relative risk. Therefore, the longer the workers had worked at this mine or lived around the mine and were exposed, they had the highest relative risk. Okay, this figure is looking at the SMR for occupational respiratory diseases by exposure duration. So we looked at 3 SMRs, one being lung cancer, the second being MNRD, and the third being asbestosis. So from this graph, you can see that the majority of workers died due to asbestosis, or their death note mentioned asbestosis of some sort. Okay, and lastly, this figure is looking at the mean employment duration and mean cumulative exposure of the workers. So from this figure, what we can see is that 248 workers who worked longer than 1 year had asbestosis mentioned in their death certificate. Okay, so a brief summary. Overall, what happened is that contamination of natural resources demanded a large-scale investigation. So the site in Libby, Montana was finally placed on the Superfund list. You can say that the majority of the workers affected were hired in or around 1950. Index C had the highest relative risk of the 3 groups that were analyzed. The highest mortality ratio was seen in workers with asbestosis, and 248 workers who worked longer than 1 year had asbestosis mentioned in their death certificate. Okay, so that is my brief overview of what happened in Libby, Montana, and just going over some brief figures.